Hey guys, welcome to the Pro Chucker 7 assembly video. I'll be showing you how to put everything together step by step. The first thing you want to do is find a solid bench to place your press on. Now, there's a number of ways you can do this, whether it's an RCBS base plate just being placed on a thick bench, or even using an inline fabrication mount. However, for this video, I'll be using an inline fabrication mount that's raised. With this particular raised mount that I have, it comes with the hardware included. Here, you can see that this actual screw here is longer than the other two. The longer screw of the three will be located in this hole back here. It will thread from underneath the base plate up into the press to where you will take your washer and your locking nut and secure that down tightly. One of the easiest ways I found to put this base plate on the press is to flip it over on its front. Then, take your base plate mount and make sure that the top hole is facing the top hole in the press itself. Then take your longer screw and insert it. Next, your washer and your locking nut. Repeat this step for this hole here and here. Now that we have our base plate secured to our press, we can install it on the riser mount here. Don't forget, if you do get one of these, you have two retaining screws at the bottom that you'll see me install here in a minute. Now, like I mentioned, our two retaining screws right here. You can go ahead and install these on the bottom to secure your press. The next step is to take your ram handle and install it inside your press. It is also recommended to tighten the handle itself with a wrench. For this next step, you're going to want to find the bag that contains these contents right here. Here we have our small rifle primer plug and our large rifle primer plug. Since I'm going to be loading 300 blackout, I'm going to be using the small rifle primer plug. Keep note the black one is always a small rifle primer plug and the silver one is a large rifle primer plug. Now, before we install that primer plug, you'll want to take the clevis pin out of the press from right here. Since we removed that pin, we can pull the handle down to raise the ram. Now that the shell plate is raised all the way up, you're going to install your primer assembly plug inside this hole right here that you'll see that's threaded from the underneath, like so. Now that you've successfully installed the primer plug, you're going to need these contents right here for the next step. Lower your rim, and now finally, you'll find the piece that we talked about just a second ago. It looks like an L or a hockey stick. You'll see 4 threads right here. Place your hockey stick or your L right inside there and install with the 4 screws that came in the same pack. Now that you've successfully installed your primer transfer bar actuator, or L, or hockey stick like I like to call it, you see in front of you 4 different primer transfer bars. Now, you can also see that each one is designated with a 7L and a 7S. 2 7S's and 2 7Ls in particular. One for the Pro Chucker 7 is all designated with 7, and then L and S designated for small rifle primer and large rifle primer. Since I'm going to be doing 300 blackout with small rifle primers, I'm going to choose the 7S right here. Now, as we lower our ram, the primer transfer bar will be placed right here. Now take note that the rear post is upward, and the side post is designated right here in front of the lip. For the next step, to install the primer dispenser, you'll need these contents right here. Also, from our previous first bag, you'll also need this piece too. Now, here's where things can get tricky. If you remember from the beginning of the video, we had two parts that we didn't use, specifically the primer dispenser seen here. The first thing that you will notice is a peg at the bottom. You'll insert that peg in this hole here, making sure that all holes are aligned properly. After that, you will use the screw from the most recent bag of contents we had opened. To be more specific, of the 3 black screws, there is 2 of the same size. Use the one of the 2 that are the same size. You will use that screw in this hole here. Finger tight is just fine. For this next step, we're going to need to install the primer safety shield by threading it onto the primer dispenser. You're going to need this one right here. Here is where we will thread our primer safety tube on. Now that we have our safety shield on, we need to pick the correct size diameter for which primer we'll be using. Like I previously said, I'm using 300 blackout. These 2 tubes right here look to be the same diameter. You will notice on the other hand that this is thicker. This is your spent primer tube. Now, there's no marking or indications on which one's small or which one's large. However, all you have to do is look inside the 2 holes and you can clearly see that this one's smaller, indicating that this is small rifle primer. Since we now have the correct primer tube, we can thread the top off of the primer safety shield and insert our tube. Your primer tubes themselves should be sticking out about 1/4 of an inch. Now we can thread the top back on. Now let's lower our ram, and now we can install our transfer bar guide. Here on the guide itself, you can see this point right here. We want this facing down towards the press. Now, put the screw in and put it down finger tight. At a later point, we can adjust this as we need it. Then, we will take our spring and install it at this peg here and here. Next, we are going to raise the ram to the middle of the stroke. Then place our retaining pin underneath so it keeps things in place as we install our shell plate holder. You will place your spring in here and your ball bearing on top. Now, ensure the case retaining springs and case eject spring right here and here are positioned outwards to allow room for the shell plate. Now we can install our shell plate. Next, you take your washer and your nylock nut and thread down until snug. Next, enter your hex key, then back off about 1/4 of a turn. Now, while holding your ram in its position, remove the locking pin and slowly lower the ram like so. We want to ensure that the index arm passes up through the shell plate and the shell plate holder itself. Now we can see that there's full functionality. We also want to make sure that the primer bar is indexing fully. Next, we will adjust our case eject spring. you want to position it right about here. And then tighten. Making sure also that there is some clearance underneath the pin itself. Next, we will install our spent primer tube. It'll go underneath this hole like this. Then you will fasten it down. Raise your rim all the way to the top. We will take our discharge chute. We're going to be using this hole right here for the screw. Make sure, when installing, to also use a washer too. Next, we will enter our die plate into the head of our press, making sure to turn clockwise. Then, we will take one of our 3 D10 screws and place them in each hole on the top of the press to secure everything down. Our last steps here will be with the powder measure install. Here, we first need to install the quick change locking pin assembly into this cylinder. Please note that only one side of the cylinder has one hole. Install here. Our next step is to take this cylinder here and install it in the main casting. First, you'll want to flip it over so that when it's installed, these 3 holes right here are facing the linkage. Now remember, this is a very precise fit, so make sure that you don't force it going in. Just like that. There's 2 more things that we need to do to this powder hopper before we can move on. First, we need to take this spring off the top post, as so. Then, we need to remove this screw down here. Next, we will take our cylinder link, install it under the screw right here. Now, take one of the 2 screws and install it in the nearest hole. Now, we will move this position upwards to where we can take the second screw and install it in the middle hole of the cylinder. Here we need to select the correct metering screw. Here you can see a large and a small. This one being the large and this one being the small. The large has a range of 10 to 110 grains of powder, while the small has a range of 0.5 to 40 grains. Since I will be using SBR SOCOM from Shooter's World, I'll be using the small insert. Now, with our metering screw, you can see a notch right about there. This notch will be indexed by the plunger on the left side that we just previously installed. Please loosen it so you can drop your meter inside your cylinder. Once you have the correct depth, you're going to want to tighten your plunger. You will feel your plunger lock into that notch. Tighten with your hand, finger tight. Now we need to lift the powder measure assembly up and out of the powder die. Now we must select the correct powder bushing, which there's 2. Small rifle being 22 through 270 and large rifle 7mm through 45, or pistol. Another thing to look out for, depending on the cartridge that you're loading, which in my case I am loading 300 Blackout, you might have to use a spacer to fully index the powder hopper all the way up. Here's my bushing, and here's my spacer. Next, we can connect the powder measure linkage and tighten the thumb screw. Now we have to insert our cartridge in the shell plate below. Then, we need to incrementally screw in the powder die until with one full stroke of the ram, the powder measure will also achieve a full stroke. Finally, we can attach the return spring. And it's a wrap. Thanks guys for watching the Pro Chucker 7 assembly video. As always, shoot straight, be safe, and happy reloading.